Welcome, insiders. Happy Tuesday. It is noon in New York, and we are back for Remnants of Dutch New Amsterdam, Part 2, with Mandy Edgecombe, our one of our best, if not the best guide we've got on the team, and a big old Dutchophile. And one of the things I forgot to mention, first of all, thank you all for joining us. Two, if you have Dutch ancestry, let us know. We'd like to know. And also, if you saw the first talk, let us know. If not, don't worry. I provided the link at the top of the chat so you could catch it later. Mandy's starting a little bit where she picked up. She's going to do a review also. But secondly, it's funny. Somebody said, no Dutch ancestry. Marcy doesn't have it. Patricia doesn't have it. I don't either. I think I was Dutch in a past life because I love the Dutch so much. But one of the first times I ever gave this tour for Untapped, I think it was the second time, a Dutch guy brought a young guy, he brought his girlfriend on the tour. And I think he was trying to show off Dutch ancestry to his New York girlfriend. And he said to me, he like hit me on the arm and he said, hey, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. And I thought that was the best thing in the world. And so Untapped actually made a limited edition t-shirt that said Untapped Cities on the front, and in back in orange, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. Jeffrey Bernard, going Dutch on dates doesn't count. Very funny. We'll count it. But with that funny story, I am going to turn it over to Mandy because, as you already know, if you saw the first one, you are in very good hands. Mandy, if you need anything, just let me know. I'm here. Go for it. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Justin. Welcome, everyone. If you were not with us the last time, this is kind of a part two. I'm just going to be talking about all the stuff that I didn't talk about before, sort of leaving off, sort of not. And obviously, please put your questions in the chat anytime you have them. It's not going to interrupt us or anything, and we will get to all of them at the end. And then if you have not seen part one, obviously, I implore you to watch that whenever you have time. That one is an hour and 25 minutes long because it was my first talk ever online. So I just kind of I didn't realize how much I was going to be talking, but I know a lot of things. So I'm happy to share them with you. I just looked at the date. Okay. I always like to talk about things that people would never think are connected to other things, right? But it's Bastille Day today, July 14th, right? Why am I mentioning that? Because one of the founders of Untapped Cities is French. But because they were here first. The Dutch were not the first colonists in this area. The French were. And it's almost a little similar thing too, because like Henry Hudson, he wasn't a Dutch person. He was an Englishman, and he was hired on behalf of the Dutch because he was a good mariner. Giovanni da Verrazzano was hired, an Italian man, hired on behalf of the French to do exploring in 1524, literally 100 years before the Dutch got here. So what does that mean? That means that natives had seen colonists, white people, way before Henry Hudson ever got into the harbor, because after that, and also similar to the Dutch, after Verrazzano, he didn't come into the upper bay of the harbor, he stayed out. But after his exploration, French fur traders came here and went up to Albany, made their way to Lake Champlain, up to Nova Scotia in Canada, and they traded with the natives all along the way. And so there is not archaeological proof at all, but there's a lot of historic documents that say that some of the Dutch forts that were placed all up along the Hudson River and some other rivers as well, that at least one of them is built on the ruins of a more ancient French fur trading fort that was already here. And that's, I love hidden history, but that is stuff, I don't know much about it. And so that would take a lot of digging in to see if we could really find some records of the French days. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about the fact that old New York was once New Amsterdam. That song is by a band called They Might Be Giants. And a couple of things we didn't talk about last time that we're going to get into now is a little bit of an indigenous culture and kind of what the deal with slavery was, particularly in New Amsterdam, because I do believe that we should all have that on our mind. We should all know these things. And let's see here. There we go. Oh, sorry. There we go. I know how to do buttons. So also, if you all don't know, a little background on myself, I've done a lot of different park rangering, Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, but most importantly to this talk, I was a park ranger on Governor's Island, and Governor's Island was actually where New Amsterdam was originally supposed to be. One thought of it, and then as we mentioned last time, one thought was actually to keep or to put New Amsterdam, or the city seat of Greater New Netherlands, in Wilmington, Delaware. That never came to fruition. And then New Sweden moved there. We talked about that last time, so you can see that other video. Really quick, I do want to show this to anybody, obviously, if you're just joining now. I want you to see this. This is the birth certificate of Manhattan. And we're going to finish a little bit talking about the records too with this. So this is the birth certificate of Manhattan. This is the document where it says, we bought the place for 60 guilders. And as we mentioned before, there's been more contemporary forensic accounting. The island of Manhattan was essentially purchased for what most likely was 15,000 US dollars worth of trade goods. So beer, brandy, axes, nails, things forged out of metal that the technology wasn't here. The Lenni Lenape is the name of essentially of the tribe that was in this area, and they would have smaller tribe names. You could also call them the Algonquin people. Algonquin is the linguistic group, the languages that they spoke. So they're also called Algonquin people. Many tribes spoke an Algonquin language all the way up north to where Iroquois Confederacy was. So if you think about like New England, basically it kind of goes Iroquois, Mohican, Mohawk, and Lenape down here. As you're going south along the water. So this is the birth certificate of Manhattan. We're very lucky to have any records that are from 1624 to 1638, because those early records ended up getting taken back to Amsterdam by the director generals that needed to kind of plead their case, because they probably got recalled for not doing a terribly good job at leading this place. There were 6 director generals all in all. Some were better than others. And our last one was Peter Stuyvesant, or Petrus Stuyvesant, as everybody knows, or Peg Leg Pete. Peg Leg Pete got his leg blown off in a battle with the Spanish in Curacao. And they just cut it off and soldered it or whatever they did. And he survived, which is kind of insane to survive something like that in the 1600s. And then his nurse ended up becoming his wife. He's buried in St. Mark's in the Bowery, in the church. That is where he's buried today. And that's where his farm was. I think it's kind of important to mention a little bit right now that, we're seeing a lot of change. Okay. One of the things that kind of really just affected me was that Gem Spa in St. Mark's is not going to be opening anymore. It's a very historic New York place. And we're in one of those modes right now of like, we're not getting into this, but we're in a transition period where, what is our future going to look like? There's an old guard that's kind of gone now, and we're all getting scared. We're seeing our small businesses in New York probably not maybe going to come back. And we were already worried about this before this happened. So that's why it's a really, really good time, especially now, to read the book, St. Mark's is Dead. And I have an email that I can send out with some updated research information. The last talk, I had a nice little email of books and movies and different things like that to mention. And so I'll make a new one of those for today. And then just email me if you would like to request that reading list. So St. Mark's is Dead is already on that reading list. And it's essentially, it goes from the history of St. Mark's to the 1600s until when the book was written. And the whole theme of it, I'm not going to tell you much about the theme, but the whole theme of it is that people have been saying that St. Mark's is dead since Peter Stuyvesant died, so it's been said for a long time. And, New York's not dying, nothing's dying. It's going to become whatever it is going to become. But I think maybe even just because of, kind of just the interesting anxiety building nature of what's going on, I feel like that book would be calming right now. Birth certificate of Manhattan. This was written in Amsterdam when the ship that took the goods back there got there. by a gentleman named Peter Shagan. And so this wasn't even written in New Amsterdam. This place is 11,000 morgens in size, which is similar to an acre. Some women have borne some children. There are mink, otter, and beaver skins on this ship. The beaver was the main export of New Amsterdam. Henry Hudson gets here in 1609. That's why that date is very important. If anybody's seen, you know, that kind of date in New York City history. He gets here in 1609. He's trying to find a passage to China because the Dutch are incredibly powerful now that they've revolted away from Habsburg Spain, and they're pissed off that the Portuguese still have the rights to the trade routes. And so they want to try to find another route to trade with China. Hudson finds Albany instead, not China. And then they obviously get into the fur trade. The fur trade had already been going on with the French and the natives before this. We are at the confluence of a lot of rivers. I'm going to show you a map in a second. And so clearly there were a lot of beavers in this area. Beaver is the most desirable pelt for fur. Not only do you take that fur and you make felt out of it for those hats that the Dutchmen would wear. And there you go. Those are the hats right there. But you would also, obviously you need to stay warm, but you would harvest these things in the wintertime when the pelts were even more waterproof and thicker. Because if you have a dog, you know, they have a different set of like shedding times throughout the year. And then those beaver pelts were then sent back home to Amsterdam, usually like around March or April, because they were harvested in the late winter, most likely. So this picture, I showed this before, this is from the Manhattan Project. And so this is what the island of Manhattan would have looked like before any kind of building and contact and things like that. So the indigenous people, the Lenni Lenape, they had different tribe names that were smaller. Wecqueesquek was a smaller tribe name, and that is what Broadway used to be called. Whether it was called that by the natives or the folks that then encountered them, I'm not too sure. But Broadway is an old Indian trail. If anybody's familiar with Jersey City, Summit Avenue and Communipaw is also the old Indian trail. So usually like the oldest road, you know, in a place, especially in New England, those likely were Indian trails before they became kind of just, you know, muddy flat roads, then became paved, you know, and so on and so on. The Lenni Lenape would live in inland camps in the wintertime, away from kind of bad weather by the ocean and the water. And as soon as the shad bush would bloom is when they knew to go to their seasonal camps. You would leave some of your more vulnerable population in the inland camps, your children and your elderly, to manage their agricultural plots, which were very small. Children would sit in trees and throw rocks at bunnies if they came around and tried to eat any of their veggies. And then you would have your other members, men and women, coming to the shoreline to harvest oysters and have political meetings with neighboring smaller tribes. Canarsie is basically what all of Brooklyn was called, but that is a smaller tribe name. The Lenape, to archaeologists, sometimes they call them the Muncie Delaware people, which I don't particularly like, because Delaware was just like this jerky English royal governor, Lord de la Warre, you know, that wasn't very nice to them. So I like to say Lenape. You'll hear people say Lenape. I think it was pronounced Lenape. Hackensack, New Jersey used to be called Akinkashaki. Hoboken used to be called Hoboken Hocking. If you ever see Hoking or Hocking at the end of a place name, it literally just means place, something place. So these natives knew to leave their winter inland camps when the shad bush bloomed. What does that mean? So if anybody's ever heard of the shad bush, it's also called serviceberry. And that would bloom early in the spring. And it was called the shad bush because it would signify when the shad, which is a fish, would migrate into New York Harbor. And they were incredibly prevalent, and they were a great food source to depend on. So that's when they would come here. Now, just recently, this was 2018, naturalists, scientists saw that the shad came back. The shad had not been back in New York Harbor for 170 years. Industrial revolution, effluent, pollution, all these things, they were gone a long time ago. 2018, they came back for the first time in 170 years, which is really amazing because it shows how much the harbor has been cleaned in the past several decades. So that made me very happy, obviously. So where's the picture? Oops, switch. This is a very pixelated small picture of the blooming shadbush or serviceberry. And so sorry about that. So this is a wampum belt. Now, wampum, we talked about a little bit last time. This was used as a currency between natives, but this bead used as a currency became more of a currency when a capitalistic thinking culture comes here to operate their colonies, right? And the Dutch, by the way, were not like the English where they wanted to come in and like actually take that land mass for themselves. The Dutch weren't about occupying land masses permanently. They wanted to come in, exploit, and then leave. And they were all very good at exploiting. So culturally, you know, what we're looking at on the page is a wampum belt. And a wampum belt is made out of wampum, which is a bead, which is a bead made out of a quahog clam shell, which we mentioned before. And it's actually very difficult to make. The purple ones, if anybody has seen the inside of quahog clam shell, the purple ones are harder to make because there's less purple on it. If you notice, it's mostly white, so they're more expensive. But these things weren't just used as currency, like, hey, I would like to buy a loaf of bread, thank you, and then, you know, trade for this. It was common, but there's much more cultural value involved in wampum. And when you have your Dutch capitalists that don't even bother wanting to or can't understand the very in-depth cultural, ritualistic, you know, traditions that the Lenape had, you know, you're going to have a lot of confusion, right? So this is a wampum belt, and Lenape and Dutch relations were not always good, and just as you can imagine. But when something like this was transferred, right? So if a Lenape gave a Director General of New Amsterdam a wampum belt, that was not in payment of anything. This was to establish a defensive alliance with that colony, the Dutch essentially, or, you know, with New Amsterdam. Now, maybe one Director General, the one that got into this agreement, understood it, but then he left. And the next one that came in, they weren't, you know, he didn't understand it. He didn't know what that meant necessarily, but the natives absolutely remembered. So then when there was, you know, skirmishes and retaliation and things like that, it's like, hey man, you completely went against our agreement. Now, the Dutch, when they wanted agreements, they wrote things down, right? So it's usually, you know, when you got to watch out when you're only getting history from the people that had the pen and the paper, right? The Dutch really loved inventorying, obviously, because it's all about numbers. It's all about capitalism. The reason that the Lower Manhattan is the financial seat of the United States is absolutely because the Dutch were, as in the late 1500s, were the best capitalists of their day. They started the first stock market in New Amsterdam in 1585. That absolutely has to do with New Amsterdam and how important investing in capitalism was to them. So wampum belt, it's a very beautiful thing. You would see clan mothers, Lenape clan mothers would be dressed in full skirts of wampum, right? To represent their status. And there was one of the Dutch colonists that was, you know, writing down records was, you know, some kind of leader type. It was like, wow, I saw a Lenape woman that had just thousands of guilders worth of wampum in her dress. That dress wasn't, it's not supposed to be worth thousands of guilders. It denotes the fact that she's a clan mother. And it was the clan mothers that would appoint who was going to be chiefs of the tribe. So the clan mother was actually much more important than perhaps a male chief that was appointed. So we talked about this before, you know, take a look at the other video when you get a sec. And this is the first video we talked about this. So I'm not going to get crazy into it, but this represents the purchase of Manhattan. We saw the birth certificate, right? And so this was like the, nice painting of the purchase, a chest full of trinkets and baubles. I'm not too sure if those, if this particular Lenape adorn themselves like this with headdresses that might not be of their culture, might be of someone else's, because this was drawn much later. Initially there was, the whole 60 guilders, the sale of Manhattan was 60 guilders, that translated into $24 US dollars. So that's why people, if you've ever heard people say like the sale of Manhattan was only $25, that's real cute, but Peter Minuit was the second director general of New Amsterdam. He was the one who made this famous purchase. Peter Minuit, or Peter Minuit Plaza, is where the Staten Island Ferry Terminal is now. The famous purchase right here, though, in this picture, most likely happened at Inwood Hill Park under a really, really large tree. There is a rock right now at the beginning of a trailhead that signifies where that large tree is, where perhaps that purchase happened. Okay, this is, and we saw this before, this is the Manatus map, and this is 1639. So 1609, Henry Hudson gets in. And after him, two gentlemen come to explore on behalf of the newly created Republic of the Netherlands, which is in the northern part. The southern part of the Netherlands stayed with Habsburg Spain. The first colonists that they brought over here were Protestants that lived in that Habsburg Spain place. They did not want to be ruled over by Catholics, obviously. And so they were kind of a perfect people to send over to the colonies, because the Republic of the Netherlands, they're like, well, we don't want to house you. The English did this too. They would just send all kinds of folks that they just didn't feel like housing or feeding, that they kind of were responsible for, to the colonies, just to, here, figure it out, see how you do. So Adrian Block of Block Island fame in Long Island Sound and Hendrik Christensen were two explorers that came in after Hudson. And as I mentioned before, Governor's Island was kind of thought of as a place where, and you can see my arrow on the cursor, this is Governor's Island. It's half as big as it is today. In early 1900s, they made it, they filled it in and made it a lot bigger to the shape that you see today. The original part of Governor's Island, where all the historic structures are, though, that's all bedrock. That's Manhattan schist, and it's a continuation of the formation of the bedrock of Manhattan here. Sea level was also a lot lower in the 1600s because there was more fresh water that was frozen in the polar ice caps. So there was actually less of a journey from the tip of Manhattan to Governor's Island then. It was a little bit shorter. Hendrik Christensen, Adrian Block, they come in and they stop on Governor's Island before they're going up to Albany, which was called Beverwijk, to trade with natives at Fort Nassau. And their Fort Nassau ended up getting turned into Fort Oranje, or Fort Orange, after it was destroyed by a natural event. And there's some really cool, this is one thing I have not gotten into yet, but I've read some reports and some articles about the archaeology in Albany, because obviously they've built over all of these old sites, kind of before anybody knew exactly where they were or really cared. But there has been, in the past 30 years, some really cool archaeology done around Fort Orange. So check that out when you get a chance. So also, actually, just see where my arrow is right now. This is not really much to do with this, but that's Liberty, Ellis, and another island. You only can see this tiny little island pop up at low tide now, but these were called the Big and Little Oyster Islands before they were, the names that they are today. And they were called that because they were completely surrounded in oyster reefs. New York Harbor, this entire area was one of the largest concentrations of oysters in the world at the time. And the Billion Oyster Project that's on Governor's Island is trying to reestablish oyster reefs. As of 2018, I think, we finally started having, I do oyster reef restoration for New Jersey Baykeeper. We finally started having babies attach and form like on their own without them having to be seeded. So these reefs, it's going to take decades and decades, but they could potentially really establish themselves back. This is an oyster shell. It's huge. You know where the best oysters were? get ready, Gowanus Canal. Don't even look at it right now. It's real dirty. The Gowanus Canal were the best and the tastiest oysters in this region because it's a very concentrated channel. And so you'll have like nutrients and different kind of terroir, you know, essentially concentrated. I don't know if you could say terroir with an oyster, really big one. This is like a much smaller one, you know, depending. But this is essentially a contemporary oyster. We just don't know where any of the smaller reefs that are out there are now. Okay, so Hendrik Christensen, Adrian Block. Adrian Block Island is named after him, and I'll tell you why. He gets here, he's got 3 ships, and you needed to take like many small ships if you were going to be doing some exploring for a lot of different reasons. 1 in 10 ships went down because of pirates or bad weather. The Dutch were really intelligent about how they invested in those ships, you know, like their merchant class essentially, because they would not just buy 1 ship. They would purchase 10% of a share of a ship because there's a really big chance that might not get to where its destination is. So the Tiger, the Fortune, and the Nightingale were the 3 ships that Adrian Block came here with and this was 1614. So we're at a time, excuse me, this is what everything looks like, okay? And we're at Lower Manhattan, and so Adrian Block has crew members that took 2 of the ships and left. They were like, you know what, we're out. And they totally left him. They kind of mutinied. And then he was left with the Tiger, and then the Tiger caught fire. So he couldn't go anywhere. He was stuck here. He was on Governor's Island, and he came over to Lower Manhattan, and he set up a kind of a little hut, and he spent the winter in 1614 in Lower Manhattan, and natives helped him rebuild the Tiger good enough to do some exploring. And he left from Hell's Gate, which is originally a Dutch word, which is a terrible place for any ship to leave or enter from today or then. A lot of currents, a lot of eddies, you know. He leaves from Hell's Gate and he kind of like boops around Long Island Sound, la la la. Block Island is named after him basically because of that. So they believe that the Tiger was found, that the remnants were found of it in the World Trade Center area. Archaeologists haven't really been able to prove that that was that actual ship. You know, you got to be careful when you see stuff on the internet too, because I was on this Facebook page called Historic New York or Historic New York City or whatever, and somebody posted it and they're like, hey, look, this is a Lenape canoe, you know, and I'm like, no, that's not a Lenape canoe. We don't know of any archaeology of Lenape canoes. I do have an archaeology degree also as well from the University of Cincinnati, so I do like to talk about that. When Peter Stuyvesant got here, one of the rules that he made, because he kind of came to, you know, whip this colony into shape because it was really neglected, because the Dutch really kind of were just more interested in fighting with the Spanish. So Peter Stuyvesant, when he came, he kind of was like a really good, tough soldier and a good leader, and he kind of came to, you know, was sent here to whip this place into shape because you had a bunch of loser director generals before that. We're looking at Greater New Netherland area with my cursor here. So it's essentially Greater New Netherland went from Connecticut River, boop, to the Delaware River, boop, right over here. And then all of this was essentially considered Greater New Netherland. We talked a lot more about that in depth before. New Sweden was in Wilmington, Delaware right here. It was thought of, you know, from these early explorers that they wanted to have their city seat in Wilmington, Delaware. And the reason for that is because if you look at New York Harbor here, we're a little bit more east. There were trade routes that had already been established between these native tribes that were a little bit west of the shoreline because it was easier to travel if there was bad weather. So the Dutch kind of were always like, well, wait a minute, you know, I want to get a little bit further west because there's more trade routes, and you had to wait till the natives got there with their stuff, right? And so there was times where natives showed up and then the Dutch had left, you know, imagine that. So we'll kind of get, this was the Manatus map we mentioned before. It says the North River. The Hudson's River was initially called the River Mauritius. Mauritius is who helped Habsburg Spain, or helped the Netherlands revolt away from Habsburg Spain. Then it was called the North River. And mariners today still call it the North River if they're in the upper bay of New York Harbor. And I've heard an old timer say that as well, who I was talking to. Now, so the funny thing, okay, so just finished up with Adrian Block. So he stays the winter in, right down here, right at the tip of Manhattan. And natives help him rebuild his ship, but not to get back to the Netherlands. They can't rebuild the ship well enough to do an ocean journey, right? So he has to wait till he's picked up. When he gets picked up, one of his crew members, who's named Juan Rodriguez, he stayed. He was like, no, I'm good. I'm gonna stay here, which is kind of like, what? Yeah. So normally in the tour, I would be like, hey, everybody, actually put it in the chat. Right? Can anybody take a guess why Juan Rodriguez probably stayed here? Go ahead and put it in the chat. I'll tell you in a second. Juan Rodriguez was he was from the island of Hispaniola. He was a trader and a sailor. And the whole idea of kind of the racism that we know today really didn't exist back then, because you could have been anywhere. New Amsterdam was the melting pot of Europe before they got here, so it makes sense that, New York is such a melting pot, and they were so successful in making so much money because of that diversity, right? So this guy, Juan Rodriguez, I can't see the chat, so I don't know if anybody said anything. Usually I get a guess that's right, though. But he most likely, and
Do you want me to tell you? There are a bunch of guesses, and they're all the same answer. Do you want me to tell you?
Yeah.
Everybody's been guessing a woman.
Yep. That's the only thing that any of us can figure out. It makes the most sense. It's in these documents. So he probably fell in love with a Lenape woman, and that tribe was like, all right, you can stay. It's fine, whatever. And so Adrian Block was like, okay, see you later. And then he gave him essentially what was going to be a couple years worth of trade goods, so that this person can establish themselves, and have a little bit of essentially kind of capital, and then continue, kind of working and living with the tribe. And nobody ever heard from him again. But if you go to the Bronx, there is a Juan Rodriguez Way, and a lot of Dominicans are just very proud of his ancestry, because technically he's like the first immigrant in New York. He's the first Dominican in New York. But you can kind of look up that story too on your own. This map we talked about last time, this is just a version of the Costello plan. So we go from 1639 here, Manatus map, to 1660 is when this was surveyed. We're at about a population of about 2,000 people at this point in time. And, we really started out with only a few hundred, and it took a kind of a while to develop. When the colony first started, the Dutch weren't into like slaving like you would think that the English were in the 1700s. That's when chattel slavery started. But prior to chattel slavery, was still was an indenture situation. So there were 11 African slaves that came to New Amsterdam when the colony was first started. They were indentures. So after 7 years, they were freed. They became very close with their families that they worked with, and they were able to start their own businesses after that and just live like anybody else. When the Dutch took over in 1664, or when the English took over from the Dutch in 1664, colony was only about 40 years altogether. The Dutch had to write letters to the English because they were much more in the business of actually going to Africa and picking up people. They had to write letters saying, don't bother this guy, don't bother this guy. This person has done their time and done their service. They have their own business. Don't you think that you can take them back into servitude? Things changed and progressed throughout the 1700s, as we know. And that is a whole topic for another time. But I do like to kind of make that clear. Now the Dutch were just as much of jerky imperialists as everybody else, just because they had like a different system of doing things, so they would enslave natives. Now, they also didn't need slaves because the colonists that they were bringing here were refugees, and they needed to work. They needed something to do, and they needed to kind of establish themselves and be able to support themselves. So it was the colonists that were working for themselves mostly. And and then natives if they had to. There was many mixed marriages too. What's really interesting is that in the past several years, European folks have been doing their ancestry and finding out that they have Native American ancestry from probably the colonial days, which is intensely interesting. This is where, let me keep my time here. Okay, we're at 12:35. So this is just a Google map overlaid with where New Amsterdam was and how much New York we have around it now. Everything that's built around that is a floodplain. So that's what's going to get flooded first. All the area in pink is just a little bit higher elevation of an upland. Last time we had mentioned this, there's a documentary on PBS called Sinking Cities, and they have a New York episode which talks all about what ideas we have for continuing sea level rise in New York. This is a view from, like you're looking at the Staten Island Ferry Terminal, basically, Lower Manhattan. We're looking at a gallows right here, and then a derrick crane to help lift heavier things off of ships inside here. This is Fort Amsterdam. Fort Amsterdam is on the exact footprint of where the Smithsonian Museum of the Native American is today, which is the only place that houses Native American history in New York City. So it's very ironic that it's on the exact footprint of a place that was meant to keep them out. The Wall of Wall Street was meant to keep out the English. The English were always pissed off the Dutch were here. You had English towns in Long Island, and those folks would come in and come steal some of the Dutch livestock because they brought more livestock over with them on their ships than the English did. This is a windmill right here. This windmill is right at the head of Battery Park. There is a flagpole there, and with some plaques describing the history. This is the scene we just saw, and it's a painting by a man named Len Tantillo. Len Tantillo and Russell Shorto gave a talk last year together at the St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, which Peter Stuyvesant is buried there. So that was really cool for me. This is the book that's kind of like the Bible of New Amsterdam. This is by Russell Shorto. Island at the Center of the World. If you do not have this, please get it. It is really, I mean, it almost reads like a novel. It is so interesting. It's just a good read, but I mean, everything you want to know about the colony is right here in this book. Len Tantillo paints Dutch scenes all over the region, Albany, Lower Manhattan. He actually hasn't gone to Governor's Island yet, but once things kind of get back to normal, I'll be taking him there, and maybe he'll be working on a painting from there one of these days. So, I mean, you just see the detail, though. He went to the Rhode Island School of Art, but he's a very, very talented painter, and he does his best working with the historians of this topic to make it as accurate as possible. Len Tantillo is his name. Email me if you want to request some of these things I'm talking about. Let's see if the button will work. Okay, Len, all right. This is the 1917 flag of New York City. It's blue and orange, very much like the flag of the Dutch West India Company. Right here, anytime you see blue and orange, it's because of the flag of the Dutch West India Company. And this has only been modified slightly since 1917. It's basically the same flag. We see the Dutch West India Company on the left. They ended up changing it to red later on in the 1650s. We talked about this last time, but this is the city symbol. Note the beavers. The beaver was the main export of New Amsterdam. And then the barrels here they represent flour. Flour was the main export of the English colony of New York. The English colony of New York is right here in Latin. Novi Eberaci is New York in Latin. It was a gift to James Stewart. James Stewart was King Charles II's brother. And within 2 years of the English taking this colony, James Stewart became the director of the Royal African Trading Company. New York was all in all, kind of essentially, if you kind of think about it this way, it was meant to be the Grand Central on the English slave trade. And that slave market was a place called the meal market. So it was grains and whatever else you're going to be selling people. That was near the South Street Seaport area, and there's a plaque that's about this big that we take people, especially when we do our maritime history tour, we take people past that, because our New Amsterdam tour doesn't hit that part. But if you're ever walking around Water Street, keep your eyes open because you might find that plaque representing where the slave market was. Let's see. There is a picture of a beaver, and I don't think I showed this last time, but this is a beaver pelt. See how thick that is, right? And it's got that, the soft fur on the inside and that like kind of longer hair stuff that helps like wick away water on the outside. So incredibly thick. This is from the fur district. It's funny when we pass these things around on tour, I'm like, you don't have to touch it if you don't want to, Now, we didn't get to this last time, but this is a little bit English history. It's on our Dutch New Amsterdam tour, and I just think it's really important because it's right in the middle of kind of where we do our talking. And so we're talking about Bowling Green Park and the Bowling Green fence. There's a plaque in Bowling Green Park right here that says that it was the first public park to be established in New York, 1733. This has been a public commons or a place to trade since the 1600s. Now, across the way, I say this way, if we're looking at the fence directly on, there's a subway there, and the subway is in the exact spot of where someone's tavern was. A guy named Martin Krieger had a tavern there, and so Dutch folks in New Amsterdam will go get drunk, and they drank beer all day because you couldn't drink water because you'd die basically. So the beer that they drank all day that they would get drunk on by the end of the day was about 2 to 3% alcohol. So they get drunk at Martin Krieger's tavern, and then they come over to Bowling Green Park to bowl. That's like, sometimes history is real simple, like, what's that? Oh, because they bowled there. Like, boop, boop, there's a simple answer. Bowling is an ancient Egyptian thing, and there's bowling balls and bowling pins brought over the New Nederland families that were French Protestants to kind of settle here. Now, what we're looking at on the left is this like rough cut thing, and there used to be a crown right on top of that fence post. So this fence got put up because there was a statue of King George in the middle of this park. Now, this park, though, this was where the Dutch wouldn't just get drunk and bowl. They traded livestock here. They traded cows here. So this is the kind of the first and main reason why the bull is associated with Wall Street. A lot of people on the tour, they mention like the bull and the bear kind of philosophy, which, yes, of course that applies too. But the first thing that was traded, in Lower Manhattan were pigs and cows. So this fence gets put up because there's a statue of King George there, and it starts getting vandalized after the Stamp Act. Put this fence up, and it's the same damn fence that got put up in 1770, the same fence. This fence, though, did get removed and get put into Central Park for a while, but then it came back, so it's still the same fence, but it did get moved. That statue came down, and so what ended up happening was July 9th, 1776, statue comes down, and this is a painting of it being taken down. Declaration of Independence is read aloud in City Hall Park, which is very similar to Boston Commons. Those rebel patriots, rebel terrorists, really, if you think about it, they go get drunk at a tavern first, and then they grab their slaves, because back then every lazy middle-class merchant had an African slave, because there was just so much extraction going on from Africa at the time. But the way people talk about it is, something that we're kind of just really getting into more now, and trying to find out more truths. So these patriots get drunk, they take their slaves, they go down, they tear down the statue, and it's gilded, but it's made out of lead, and it gets melted down into 42,088 musket balls used against the British in the Revolutionary War. Archaeologists found one of those musket balls in Monmouth battlefield and got it tested in 2017. Untapped Cities has articles about this. So one of those musket balls might have even gone through a redcoat at some point in time, which is kind of the most badass American history story I can think of. But where's the Dutch stuff right here? This right here, the stepped gables. This tells you how much Dutch architecture really was, in this region. We don't see any of it anymore. 1776, Patriots basically burned down Lower Manhattan because the English occupied it. So I kind of can't blame them for that. You know, this is an arm of the statue. So pieces of the statue got given to kind of like notable Tories and patriots of the time. And it was sent to a foundry in Connecticut. So there's still homes in Connecticut. This was found last year. Untapped Cities did an article about it. This arm was for sale for $25,000. So just in case anybody's in the market. This was found in someone's basement, you know, and they obviously did the X-ray diffraction testing to it. I love how much I talk. Oh God, I'm gonna go for 5 more minutes and then we're just gonna do question and answer from 12:50 to 1 o'clock. Justin, if you wouldn't mind giving me like a ding dong when that happens. This also is English stuff. Justin and I talked in the beginning. He's like, is this going to be your last Dutch New Amsterdam talk? I'm like, yeah, totally. I'm not going to have anything to talk about after this. I literally could talk for another hour. So it's up to you all if you want to see this again. The battery is named after a battery wall that the English built to fortify the colony more than the Dutch did. The Dutch had some cannons around, you know, and they had the wall, whatever, but they weren't as protected. So this battery wall was a kind of a wall in the front, you know, and then you had Wall Street, which was like the wall in the back. You had farms obviously beyond the wall, but you had your main city center located in there. In 2005, this was found. So what ended up happening, so if you follow my arrow, and this is talked about in the last one too, there was not a lot of land reclamation done during the Dutch days. It was done more in the English days. And that's how we have more of, you know, that built up part of Manhattan. And so you would fill in, if you paid the money to fill in junk in the space between 2 piers, you then owned that land. And so that's how this wall ended up getting preserved, because it just got kind of really nicely filled with some junk right over that wall. And then they kept building outwards, right? And building outwards. So archaeologists found this in 2005. The Starbucks on State Street that faces Battery Park is essentially where this stuff was found. You can see pieces of this wall. Actually, there's a picture, the cover picture for my last talk has a piece of this wall that's down in the subway station, 456, right in front of the Staten Island Ferry. And then there's also a piece at Castle Clinton, and you could just walk right in there and take a look at it. We're gonna go. Pearl Street in the 17th century. Pearl Street gets its name because there was a Native American shell midden, and so as you kind of walk over these shells and they get crushed, they're kind of like pearlescence in the sun. You see those stepped gables right here. This is the Stadthaus, which was the first city hall of New York. This is a plaque showing the archaeology of the Stadthaus block. Urban archaeology in New York was developed because of this project. It was the first major urban archaeological excavation in New York City. It was carried out by Diana Cantwell, or Diana Zarega Wall and Anne Marie Cantwell. And then they did this book, Unearthing Gotham, right? I mean, like, you know, this is an important one here. There's also an addendum to it that 8 archaeological walking tours that you could do for yourself. But this is a very important copy of a book for New York City history lovers. This is Pearl Street. Across the way is kind of like up this way, boop, 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 is Francis Tavern. For anybody walking around there. This is basically some of the only archaeology you can see in New York. If you think about when you go to European countries or Italy or Greece or whatever, it's just laying around everywhere, you know, and they show it off everywhere, and we kind of didn't do that. So if you look in, you get to see rebuilt by archaeological artists the remnants of the first city hall, or the Stadthaus that we showed before. And it's essentially to the right here. And this is Broad Street. Broad Street used to just be a canal, kind of a stinking sewer. So before I get on with that, let me watch my time here, just a few more minutes. Across the street, so what we're actually looking at is not the Stadthaus. This is Lovelace's Tavern. Governor Lovelace was one of the first English governors to rule this area. The Stadthaus was under disrepair because it was getting flooded all the time. So what this excavation is actually of Lovelace's Tavern. And I thought I had a picture of excavation. Sorry, I had to go back here. This is pixelated and really hard to see. This is from the Museum of the City of New York's page, but that's it. That's what that's the excavation of Lovelace's Tavern. So they clearly had to rebuild it, you know, to make it look like little foundations and stuff. And so you'll see that when you ever go around there, or when I can take you there, because I would love to do that. So we talked about the basement of Federal Hall before. The basement of Federal Hall has, here we go, right here where my arrow is. Federal Hall is essentially like right here, right on Wall Street, and Wall Street was an actual wall. That's the land gate. Now over to the right is the water gate. The remnants of that wall are right here on the left. This is the wall of Wall Street. Archaeologists still have to go in and do some more testing, but for all intent and purpose, we basically know it's that. On the right, those rocks right there, so this is the basement of City Hall. This was the worst jail you could ever think to be in. You would be bolted with manacles on the floor. So this was essentially like the bad jail of the English colony. And I have a piece about that, describing that stuff, coming out very shortly. Let me just see here.
Did I ding dong you, or do you want to?
Ding dong, we're done. And so just this last page, if
Okay,
anybody is, sorry, 1 second, this is the last one, sorry. Thank you for doing that.
No,
the last time I didn't talk about this, but we talked about Peter Stuyvesant last time, so check that out. But we didn't talk about his pear tree, and pear was his favorite fruit. So that tree that you see in the picture on the left, that was on the corner of 10th and 3rd, which is right where St. Mark's Church is, which is where his entire farm was. That tree came down, a truck hit, or a cart backed into it, and it ended up coming down in the late 1800s. But it was there for a pretty long time. There is a plaque on that corner of 10th and 3rd talking about it out front of a Kiehl's store. I'm done. All right, let's talk about.
Well, no, my suggestion was, so you are getting requests for part 3, so I didn't want you to rush through this stuff in the event that you thought we were going to cut you off here to never talk again. So
never again.
But anyway, we definitely have some questions. Can you do me a favor? Can you go back to that picture of around 85 Broad Street? Not that one. Go back. Keep going. Keep going.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I know. Here?
Nope. Keep going. That one. Stop. Go back. That one. 2 more. 2 forward. There you go. So one of my favorite little factoids about the work that Mandy was talking about is that this yellow brick outline on the ground is where the Stadthaus should be. That's what they were hoping they were. That's where its location is. And so
I have to apologize because I was looking at this wrong. I thought this was going up Broad, and it's not. This is Pearl.
So next time, it's no problem. Next time that you are there, that's where the first City Hall was supposed to be, which again, beyond that stop sign is water.
There's where the remnants are, right here.
Lorraine, the little standalone building, I think you mean, is the entrance to the 5 train.
That is the entrance to the 5 train, specifically designed as Dutch architecture to pay homage to New Amsterdam. It's called a station house, essentially.
So we did have a couple questions through the presentation. Back when we were talking about the Native Americans and sort of you were talking about the clan mothers and the chiefs, Jeffrey Bernard asked, how were conflicts adjudicated?
I can't get into too much detail in that way. I mean, what I can say is, because I don't know the details to that, but it has to be really clear that like these natives had been warring with each other way longer than we ever got here. You know, we're primates essentially, right? You know, I mean, it's all about domination and things like that, but just because the Dutch didn't feel like learning the way that they did things culturally, it didn't mean that they didn't have an intensely advanced system. Retribution, obviously, retaliation, things like that were very different. But, you know, okay, so if I can answer this question slightly, you know, if something happened to a tribe's individual, they would retaliate because that thing that happened basically wasn't supposed to, because there were meetings where wampum belts were transferred. So it's like, okay, you Dutch, you want to come in and have this land, and you want to like buy this land and have like somebody write down some deed or something. That's really cute. We'll sign all those stupid deeds you want. We don't sell land though. So like you're kind of here leasing it and we're still living here and we're not going anywhere. And that was kind of like people kind of didn't understand that, but the wampum belt transfer was supposed to be like, hey, we're friends. We have like, you know, a lot different types of tools than you. We're here. You taught us how to use the food sources around this area. You know, we're supposed to give you defense, or that's what, you know, and then that wouldn't happen all the time. But that's a really great question. And I roundabout kind of not answered it.
Well, no, actually that was, so one of the things while you were talking, Mandy, I put in a link to a great book called Native New Yorkers, which was about sort of the Lenape traditions that were here when, you know, the French and Verrazano arrived and when the Dutch arrived. They actually tell that story about meeting Verrazano.
Native New Yorkers, great, because I need that too.
Yeah, and you know where you can buy it if you don't, well, you could order it on Amazon. I think there's digital Kindle too, but I bought mine years ago at the Smithsonian, like 12, 15, 13 years ago. They sold it at the gift store at in the customs house.
Fantastic.
But there were trees. So trees were very important to the Lenape, and they were important for conflict mediation and for trade. So a lot of the parks that we have in Lower Manhattan today were believed to be spots where these giant Lenape trees were.
And they were tulip trees.
Yes, they were tulip trees, right?
Yeah.
Which is another reason why, you know, so Bowling Green, there was supposedly a tree there, right in front of St. Paul's, where City Hall Park is today. There was another big tree there, and one of the big debates had been is whether or not one of those trees could have possibly been where the brokerage of the island of Manhattan was done. Although, you know, everybody says it's Inwood and it's been pretty much confirmed to Inwood, but there are new historians who are coming back and saying, it may have been in front of St. Paul's, or it may have been down at Bowling Green. Nobody knows for sure.
I just read that about the tree.
It's like literally last year somebody came out and said that could have very well been in front of St. Paul's where City Hall Park is today, which would be very interesting. David, I bought it in the same place at the American Indian Museum. Another question that came, Mandy, can you go back to the Manatee map? So I think Pete asked, and I took a guess, but I want you to confer as well. Oh, whoa, sorry. Before you do that, go back to the plaque picture in Bowling Green. Oh, okay. We're at Manatee. Don't worry about it. No, hold on, everybody. We're going back and forth.
Wait. Bowling Green first. Hold on.
Go to Bowling Green
back. Okay.
This one. Oh, yeah. Do you remember why there were flowers?
Oh, are you asking me?
Oh, God. Now
I
remember.
Do. You're right.
That's right. Because Pete was saying, is somebody buried there? No. Do you want to tell the story?
So this is politics stuff, but it was when Kellyanne Conway mentioned the Bowling Green Massacre, which was not a massacre. There's also a place called Bowling Green in Kentucky. I used to live near there. But after that, that's why I specifically picked this picture, because I had to take it, obviously. After that all came out, you saw flowers. You saw flowers in Bowling Green Park in New York. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so that was solved. Now go back to Manatee. Sorry. I knew there was, I couldn't remember what it was.
Why is there flowers?
And I was like, oh, they put, I told Pete in the chat, I was like, well, they plant flowers around the fountain and then they cut. No, totally forgot about the Bowling Green Massacre.
Bowling Green Massacre,
I was with you when you took that picture. All right, so, okay, this one. So Pete was asking, you see that little peninsula, well, it's not even a peninsula, it's technically an island, jutting out a little south of Governors.
That's Red Hook,
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that's what I had guessed, but I wanted you to confirm. Also,
these are stylized.
Right. Because that's Coney, that little circle down there is Coney Island. It even says it.
Coney means rabbit in Dutch. Jamaica Bay Jamaica is a bastardized word for the word beaver in Algonquin, which was Yamaco or Jamaco. That's where that comes from, by the way, just because you're mentioning it.
The other question for the Manatee map was, somebody asked, why was it called the North River? North of what? Now, I did not answer this. My guess is because if you look at, if this was the view that people were taking, this is on the north side of the island of Manhattan, but it could be because it goes north. right?
Yeah, the Delaware River was called the South River. North,
Oh,
south,
oh, okay.
north here, or north and then south, basically.
So it's a border thing.
Yeah, or like this is the big river in the north and that's the big river in the south.
Okay,
Essentially, yeah.
cool. Was there another question that I did not get an answer for? I think that was what we had picked out from the chat.
There's
Any
two
other
things I'm going to mention. Yeah, any other questions? I'm just going to tell you two little factoids before we go.
Go for it. Nobody's got anything at the moment, but I'll keep.
I'm working on something right now. I mentioned last time that Sojourner Truth, her first language was Dutch because she was born in Ulster County. I started getting down a deep dive on the internet, you know, of course, got a lot of time for that now. But her name ended up becoming Sojourner Van Wegenen, okay? So Van Wegenen is the name of the family that owned the Apple Tree House from our Bergen Square, Jersey City Dutch tour that we saw. And they're a famous Dutch family. There's a lot of Van Wegenens buried in Jersey City. It was Maria and Isaac Van Wegenen. And I've been going on these Dutch genealogy pages. I put a post up, but it kind of got lost. Asking any Van Wegenen descendants if they have seen Maria and Isaac pop up, because I would just love to connect the Van Wegenens of Bergen Square to the people that they essentially purchased Sojourner to get her out of slavery, and they refused to have her call them anything but their first names. You know, and after that, she was not going to be, you know, working for anybody anymore. But I just thought that was really interesting. So Sojourner Truth's name ended up becoming Sojourner Van Wegenen before she stopped working for them and then was just married. So there's that one. I don't know if I mentioned this before. Adrian Vanderdonk needs his own hour, okay? But if anybody has ever been to Yonkers, Yonkers, Jonker comes from the word Jonker. Jonker means squire in Dutch or lawyer, and Adrian Vanderdonk was a lawyer, and that's where that word comes from. He was a humanist, and he had really good relationships with the natives, and he was writing down some of their culture and just kind of looked at them differently, right? You had a smaller population of humanists than you did of folks that were just kind of there to plunder and exploit or just work and make money for their individual selves. It's just like business. You know, business has been business for a long time. Last thing too, so I don't know if I mentioned this before, but there's a person that came over to New Amsterdam, and his name was Jan Eritzson. Jan Eritzson came over as an indentured servant. He became free, you know, after several generations, kept having families in this area. And then one of his either him or one of his descendants had the idea of, you know, we're going to change our last name to reflect where we're from, which was very common. You know, Van Wegenens, that's from Wegenen. And so they changed their last name to De Bilt. And if you're from De Bilt, you would say Van der Bilt. And so the Vanderbilt family came here as indentured servants in the Dutch days. Done talking.
Love those Der Bilts. Also, because of Jonker and Adrian, we get Yankee. That's how
Yes.
the word Yankee comes from that as well.
Jan and Case. Oh yeah, I've said Jan like a million times before. It's basically just John, you know, but Jan and Case. If you ever see the two vowels, right, it's actually a soft sound. It's not like, you know, like the tree that Justin was talking about, the tulip tree was called oud boom, but it was like oud bomb, basically. You wouldn't say that same way. So Case instead of keys.
I have learned through giving many tours how wrong I'm saying Dutch words.
Yes, me all the time.
And then I continue to say them wrong because my brain doesn't process them. But all right, so Mandy, I think we're gonna have to do round 3.
Sure.
I think we should focus a lot on Stuyvesant's administration.
Okay.
Because there's so much to talk about there.
You know what? And that's great because I didn't talk about Bogardus either one of these times.
Right.
He's very,
and
so we can get into those deeper stories.
I mean, the Rapalgis are great too. Rapalgis came on the tour. God.
And and I know so many of their descendants from these Facebook pages that I'm on too. There's a lot of Dutch genealogy pages that people are always sharing.
So we'll do round 3, and then we're Mandy and I are putting together a Stone Street talk, which will also have Dutch roots in it. We're going to do that one together. So we'll have plenty of stuff. There's still so much more to talk about, but we will let you go. It's 1:05
Thank you,
for
everybody.
today. But we enjoy, Mandy, always a pleasure as usual. I was sitting in Mandy's living room yesterday having lunch, so we were excited.
It was so lovely.
It was very good too. She makes a mean roast chicken.
Email me with anything. If you want the old reading list from the other one, you want a new reading list, whatever, just feel free to reach out and we can chat.
Yeah, so people are asking for the reading list. Do you have it? Can you email it out, or do you?
I got an old one that I can email out, and I'm just going to put it all together, but I'm going to make a new one now.
All right, here's the deal. I give you the, do you want me to do it, or do you want me to give you the registry with the emails, and do you want to do it? It's up to you.
Send it to you if I can.
Send it to me. I'll do it. I'll email the reading list out when she gives it to me.
Yay.
I'll do both of them. How about that?
Cool. Yeah, and then anybody, if you need, you're interested in more research topics and things like that, obviously feel free to reach out if you need to.
We're nerds.
Yeah. Can't you tell?
All right, everybody. Have a great day. As usual, stay safe. This week, just so you know, I send an email out tomorrow. Setauket virtual tour was postponed because we could not get any signal in Setauket. It was very, very sad and depressing. Basically, Michelle would sign on and it would freeze. That's all we got. So we are turning that into a virtual talk that Michelle will lead probably at some point in August. So nothing tomorrow. And then Thursday, we are part 2 of our partnership with the UN 75. We're doing the architecture of the UN. And that's going to be super fun at noon. So hopefully we will see you then. If anybody's interested, tomorrow at noon, I am giving the underground subway talk, which I've done for you as insiders to Fordham University. But if anybody missed it and wants to see it live, I can give you the link. If not, it is also in the archive. So you can email me, justin@untappedcities.com if you're interested. Only taxes tomorrow, Klaus. That's right. Only taxes. Or if you want to sign on and watch me do the subway again. It's one of my favorites, so I'm happy to do it for Fordham. All right. So have a good day, guys. Stay safe.
Subway.
Thank you, Mandy.
Subway.
Everybody, be well. Hopefully we'll see you Thursday. Bye.
Tot ziens. Thank you. Dankjewel.
Yeah.